And thank you so much for having me. My name is Cortney Harding. I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Friends with Holograms, and we make virtual reality for learning and training. We focus primarily on education, and we also work with a lot of different companies to help them understand how to expand educational opportunities in the metaverse. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Very excited to be chatting with such a great group, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. But hopefully, this is a great thought starter for everyone. Hopefully, this is something that gets people more interested in this technology. And at the end of this talk, I'll let you know how you can find me online. I'm always happy to chat more over social media or over email if you'd like to learn more, if you have any questions. I know that this format makes it a little difficult, right, to be interactive, but it is what it is. So let's go ahead and get started. So, like I said up top, my name is Cortney Harding, and I've been working in this space for just over 6 years now. So, I discovered virtual reality in 2015, a long time ago. And the first piece I saw, I just was blown away by it. I really thought I saw the future. And I'm still think I'm seeing the future when I do this work, even though it has evolved and changed in so many ways. And that's something to really think about when we talk about the metaverse. When I was preparing to give this talk, I was chatting with some members of the team putting on this conference, and they asked me specifically, do you think the metaverse has applications in education right now? And I said, yes, and here's why. So the metaverse is not a fixed state, right? The metaverse is something we can define as a space where people embody avatars and primarily use their voices to communicate. It's cross device. It's best experienced, I think, in a VR headset because that's the most immersive way to experience it. But it can and should be experienced on laptops, tablets, and other formats because that allows the widest range of people to participate. So, right now, if you teach especially younger students, you're going to see that a lot of them are using Roblox. They're using it to socialize. People are using Roblox for education. And that's the metaverse right there. You can look at all these other worlds, Horizon Worlds, which is Meta's world, Decentraland, Spatial, Arthur, Engage, Victory XR, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. All of these platforms are fantastic. They're great for different use cases. But let's not forget one thing, all of this is still very early. So I saw something a couple days ago that said it was the 28th anniversary of GeoCities. And if you're as old as I am, you remember GeoCities pages from the 90s very clearly. Now, in retrospect, they look atrocious. I was looking at one a few days ago just for fun, and I thought, my God, this is making my eyes bleed. It's so bad. But at the time, I thought, this is the future, right? Think of how excited we all were in the 1990s when we got America Online or whatever provider you were using in Spain. These discs that you would have to put in and sign up, and you'd have to dial in with a modem. I won't make the noise, but if you're old enough, you definitely remember it. It's baked into your brain, right? And at the time, we were like, "This is the future. How exciting!" Now that seems extremely primitive to us, 20 plus years later. So I want to caution people when you think about headsets, you think about these different worlds, you think about how the avatars don't have legs or some of them look kind of clunky or silly. Keep in mind that this is not the final state. There is no final state for any of this technology. So be open minded when you think about this, right? So if I can start you off with any advice, it would be that. The organizers of the conference sent me some great guiding questions, and I'm going to structure my talk around those because I think that's really instructive. So the first question, which I think is on everyone's mind, which is what difference will the metaverse make to student learning, right? It is common for us to see new technology, it's a shiny object, we get very excited about it. And then, of course, we start thinking, well, what is this actually going to do? How is this going to impact anything? And I'd like to offer one case study in how the metaverse is impacting education. And I want to caveat this use case because it is from one university in the United States of America. It is one class, it's one professor. So don't read too much into it, right? I want to state that up front. This is not definitive research. However, it is illustrative of the power of learning in the metaverse. So, Morehouse College, which is a historically Black institution in Atlanta, which is in the southern part of the United States, has been working in the metaverse for several years now. They've partnered with a group called Victory XR, who are fantastic. I would highly encourage folks to check out Victory XR. I've been working with them for a long time. Their founder is wonderful. So Morehouse and Victory XR had been working together and they decided to basically try an experiment. So they divided up a class into three groups. Group one learned the way they've always learned, essentially, right? They went to class, they went to lectures in person, they had office hours, all of that stuff. Group two basically kept the pandemic learning model. So they were learning on Zoom. And group three learned in the metaverse. They learned in this platform and headset. So they went through the class and all the groups were divided up and they were doing the exact same coursework, taking the exact same exams. Everything was the same except for the learning modality. At the end of the semester, they averaged out the grades for each of the three groups. The first group, the group that learned in classroom, averaged 78. So that's a C plus in the US, right? That's not great. That's pretty bad, in fact. Group two, the Zoom group, actually, and this is a little shocking to me, scored slightly higher. So their average was an 82. That's a B minus. Again, not great. And there's a little bit of variation in there depending on the students. So you could kind of explain that. The average grade for the metaverse group was 95. That's an A. That's quite good. So again, I caution you not to read too much into it because I have to caution myself not to read too much into it when I get very excited about this. But the fact remains, we see these huge jumps in learning when we learn in the metaverse. Now, there's a lot more research in terms of learning and training in sort of the work world in the metaverse, and we see similar types of numbers. A couple of projects I worked on have had these incredible results where I built a piece for child welfare workers in the United States several years ago. And that piece was deployed in two different states. And within 6 months, with everything else being equal, the rate of workers leaving their jobs dropped by 31%. So you see these great outcomes. You see things like 70% performance improvement, 40% more learning retention. All of these things are so powerful. Another great use case for education in the metaverse comes from University College of London and their medical school. So they did a partnership with Johnson and Johnson and with Meta, and they had students break into two groups and learn a simple medical procedure, half the group the normal way, half the group in headset. After they'd gone through the whole learning and the whole lesson, they put the two groups in with a cadaver and said, okay, now you need to replicate this procedure. 83% of the metaverse group were able to do it with very minimal guidance. None, zero of the other group were able to do that. So again, these are small case studies, but they are powerful and important, and we start to see these results more and more often. So that's where it gets really important to think about the difference that the metaverse makes to student learning. Now let's talk about why, right? Because I think there are several reasons. And the first and the simplest and most basic reason is that students are less distracted when they learn in the metaverse. Now, we've all spent a lot of time on Zoom in the last few years. And if you're anything like me, you're not paying attention when you're on Zoom, unless you're presenting or unless you're in a one-on-one or a very small group. You're off in the middle of nowhere. You are checking your email, you're looking at Twitter, you're reading the news, you're checking your stocks, you're doing whatever it is you're doing, but you're not actively paying attention. Even in classroom learning in the United States anyway, at the university level, which is where I have most of my experience, students all have laptops in class. And I'm not kidding myself that they are taking like very deep notes and following along when I'm talking. They're goofing around online, they're emailing their friends, they're watching YouTube videos, they're not paying attention. In the metaverse, you have to pay attention because the distractions are limited. If you're in headset, you literally cannot multitask because you have a headset strapped to your face. Now, there's ways around it that you can do with kind of like tilting your head back and looking at your phone at a certain angle if you need to reply to an emergency text or something, but it's very difficult, right? So that's the simplest and most blunt reason is you're not distracted, right? Let's also think about how many times you can make a mistake in the metaverse versus in the real world. So in the metaverse, all you have to do is restart the simulation. So if you're dissecting something in a biology class, for example, and you make a mistake, well, there you go. That's your only frog that you get to cut up. So now you just have to sit the rest of the lesson out. In the metaverse, you can slice and dice and change. Doesn't matter. Just hit reset, hit reset, hit reset. So it's great for resources, right? You're not using as many resources. And it's also great because you can try and fail as much as you need to. It is endless. It is limitless. You can go through a simulation 100 times if you want. There's a great case where a man that I was talking to built a training simulation for the company he worked for. And I can't give too many details, unfortunately, because it's under NDA, but it's a great story. So he was having a really hard time getting his employees to come to a training because it was a really boring training. They were learning a basic skill that was important, but kind of dull, and no one wanted to do it. Everyone resisted. He would have to drag people in, and it was terrible. So he thought, all right, I'm going to put this in VR just to see, just for an experiment. So he puts it in VR, gets some headsets, puts them in the office, and then gets people to come do the training. A training that he previously had to coerce people to attend, people were now coming back and saying, I want to play the game again. I want to play the game again, right? That's the power of this stuff. Going from people who just literally complained and whined and moaned and had to be dragged to a training to people lining up outside his office, waiting to grab a headset so they could play the game over and over. And they were learning skills, right? It wasn't just a fun video game. It wasn't a, first person zombie shooter or whatever people, Beat Saber, or whatever people like to play in VR. It was, in fact, educational. So you can create these worlds and create these simulations where people actually want to learn. They want to play the game. They want to be involved. So that's where things get really interesting and really impactful, right? So I want to talk about what type of learning it could be suitable for next, because I do think there are types of learning where it's better than others. So in terms of technical training, it's fantastic for the reasons I sort of laid out above. You can make mistakes as many times as you need to, right? If you are training, especially in something that is expensive to train people on, sort of fiddly to train people on, then doing it in VR before you actually do it in real life is fantastic. Now, eventually people will have to learn how to do things outside of VR and outside of the metaverse, but they will be so much better off, right? And make fewer mistakes going in that you don't have to worry about replacing equipment. You don't have to worry about the cost of that. KLM, the airline in the Netherlands, invited me to their office a few years ago, and I got to play with a lot of their simulations for pilot and flight attendant training. And they said one of the reasons that those have been so popular in the company is because previously they had to take airplanes out of commission and allow people to train in them and learn and make mistakes and spend time in the planes. And that's money the company was losing, right? If planes aren't flying, they're not making money. Now they let people just sit in a classroom, sit in an office, or even sit in their own homes, do all of this training leading up to the final test. So they're actually saving tons of money. And what they're discovering is people are learning faster. They're not under pressure. They can make mistakes without somebody watching them in the simulation. So that's really exciting. In terms of soft skills training, that's really critical, right? So that's a lot of what I work on. So I'm really personally invested in a lot of this stuff. We see people go into a headset and go through a soft skills training and feel something that they've never felt before. Because this allows you to go into a world that is completely unknown to you as yourself and have things happen to you that you might not otherwise experience. We built a piece on racial bias for a large store chain in the United States because they'd had some bias incidents in their stores and they wanted to combat that. So what we did was we put people in headset as a shopper, which is a common experience that everyone can relate to. Everyone's been to a store. And then they experienced somebody coming up and basically profiling them. And all they knew was they were themselves. They didn't have to pretend to be somebody else. They just got to feel what it felt like. And people were shocked. People were horrified. People were upset. And that's good. That's what we want. We want that sense of empathy. We want people to understand these things so that they can prevent it, right? And I think that's so valuable for students too, as we have a more diverse student population. Understanding others' feelings is really critical. Now let's talk about the metaverse in sort of the world sense, right? So we've talked about virtual reality for training soft skills, for training hard skills. Now we'll talk about the metaverse for learning. One thing that's really interesting is an experiment where a group of employees at a company ranging from sort of C-suite, so the very top, to, brand new employees who'd been there 6 months. They selected a random group from all the different levels, and they put them in a room, in a virtual room, and asked them to brainstorm a solution to a problem. Now, the cool thing about this is that everyone looked the same. Everyone was the same avatar, and it was a very cartoonish avatar. It was like a pink bunny or something, very silly and very harmless and friendly. And everyone had the same voice because the voices were masked. So you couldn't tell who was speaking, if it was a man, if it was a woman, what their accent was. Any of that stuff was gone. They sounded like they were in witness protection, basically. And no one's name was known. It was just numbers. It was 1 through 10, and it was randomly assigned. So when they did this brainstorming session, what was fascinating was because the younger, newer employees weren't intimidated by the fact that there were senior executives in the room, they were able to speak their minds and be free and collaborate. And it took all the hierarchy out of it. And so, again, this is just one experiment, but everyone felt really satisfied afterwards. So, that's the type of thing you can do. You can bring people together in a way that allows everyone to express themselves, right? You can let people, again, collaborate and learn and grow in a space where maybe everyone is spread out. So, if you're teaching a remote class, for example, people feel like they're there, people feel embodied. You can watch everyone do the experiment together if you're teaching like a science class, because, if they're at home, you don't know what they're doing. They're kind of cutting stuff up and you can't really see what they're doing on Zoom. And it allows you to really put groups of people together, mix people up. You can do these changes where people are all the same avatar. So it kind of takes some of the hierarchy out of it, like I said. So there's a lot of amazing things you can do in this space if you're willing to just experiment and play with the technology. So, talking about, so the next question that was offered to me to address in this talk, which I think is really interesting, dealt with how expensive is the metaverse, right? That's something that people I don't think really understand. So, if you came to VR a few years ago, your impression of it is probably very different than what the reality is now. When I started in 2016, headsets were thousands of dollars. I remember the first big headset that I bought for my company. I spent $2,500 on a gaming laptop and the headset, and I had these little trackers I had to set up, and traveling with it was a nightmare, right? I had to get these big cases to ship the headset around, and it was awful. I mean, it was a great headset, terrible experience. Now, a headset will run you $400 new and even cheaper used. And you can literally put it in your handbag. I can't get mine because it's out of the way, but they're very small. I have mine in my purse at all times or in a backpack. They're easy and they're cheap. And the payoff is enormous, right? In education, it's a little different than in corporate. In corporate, it's easy to measure the payoff, right? You save money because employees train more quickly. You don't have to pay those extra training costs. That recoups the cost of the headsets and building the training. Easy math. With schools, it's more challenging, right? Because we don't measure student productivity on, monetary. So it's a little bit trickier, but we can still measure student performance, like I said at the top. And better student performance makes the case for making that investment, right? We want to invest in our students. We want to invest in the people we're teaching. So that's where it really comes in. Now, you have to develop curriculum, obviously, and there is a cost to that. But there are a lot of platforms out there that allow teachers to basically create their own curriculum. And it's at the same level as like a Squarespace website, right? Most people can build a Squarespace website. You need to know a little bit, you can kind of figure it out, you can watch some YouTube videos, and then you build it. It's the same with these platforms. There's one called Uptail, which is French. There's one called Warp VR, which I believe is Dutch. There's a couple others. They're all great. They all have slight differences, but they're all pretty good. And you can take your lessons and literally just put them into VR. It's the same with teaching in the metaverse. You can take these lessons and just teach them like you would in a classroom in a virtual world. You can put your presentations in there. You can have the students come as avatars. You can be embodied together. You can record it and have the students watch it later. Like, you can take all of your content and put it in relatively easily. Not to mention, there are lots and lots of educational platforms and educational VR pieces out there that you can kind of download, dig into, have the students watch, have the students interact with. So it actually is pretty simple. I was speaking earlier to somebody and they were talking about, again, this cost and the time that it takes, right? And I said, look, from about 2004, 2005, when broadband internet was widely available in most parts of the United States, people were asking schools to do distance learning. And the answer always was no. It's too hard to figure out. No one can do it. The students won't like it, blah, blah, blah. Like tons of excuses. And in very rare cases, schools actually did it, but it was very rare. Okay. Now, all of a sudden, in 2020, in March, when all the schools in the US shut down, everyone managed to figure it out in about 3 weeks while people were just dying everywhere, right? The country was in absolute chaos. No one knew what was happening. In New York City, there were sirens 24/7. It was awful. It was terrible. And yet somehow all of us went from distance working, distance learning, never happen, can't do it, to we figured it out. Wasn't that hard. Was it perfect? No. Were mistakes made? Absolutely. But it was doable and it was done. And that's kind of the great quote, right? It looks impossible until you do it. So with the metaverse, adopting it for education, it's the same thing. There's tons of excuses. There's tons of reasons not to. But there are more reasons to actually do it. And every problem that you think about, managing the headsets, buying the headsets, putting curriculum in there, every single one of those problems is solvable and, in fact, relatively easy to solve. So, the idea that it's too expensive, the idea that there's resistance, people will come to it. And if you really are invested in your students and in your learning, you'll come to it sooner rather than later. Now let's talk about the role of teachers in this environment, because it's not that different, right? Teachers guide learning. Teachers work with students. They bring out the best in students. I am so lucky to come from a family of educators. My father was a school principal. My mother was a teacher. My sister's a teacher. I'm an adjunct at several universities. So I'm very blessed to have this great educational background. And that's what you do as a teacher. You guide the students towards the outcomes that they want to learn. So, yeah, is there going to be a little bit of a learning curve when you have to think about facilitating a classroom full of students, managing a classroom full of students in headset versus in person? Sure. But you can figure it out. You're all smart people. You can learn it, right? And the nice thing about this too is it breaks down all the distance barriers. So let's say there's a professor at a university whose work you admire. You would love to have that person come talk to your students and lead a demonstration. That's obviously very hard to do in person if that person, in fact, lives in Japan and you're in Spain, right? Yeah, you can do it on Zoom. It's not great. It's a little clunky. You could have that person come in as an avatar and do an amazing demonstration for the students in the metaverse, and it's going to feel like you're all really together. So that's what it does. It expands learning. And the great thing we're going to start seeing is when other teachers are building in the metaverse and putting their work out into the world to be shared, there's going to be this incredible library of knowledge that you can pull from, and you can put lesson plans together based on what other people have built and figure something out. You're going to learn new things. You're going to learn new methodologies. So it's really exciting. And at the end of the day, the core function will not change, right? But the way you can accomplish that core function is going to really change for the better. Now, let's also talk about the digital divide, because this is unfortunately a huge issue. It's a huge issue in the US. I'm assuming it's a huge issue in Spain because of the nature of the question, and it's really all over the world, unless you're talking about very specific small populations, right? Singapore, I think, does a good job of erasing that digital divide, but they're kind of an outlier and they're also a very tiny country. So absolutely, this is something we need to address. And this has deeper structural issues outside of just the metaverse, right? So in the United States, I said earlier that most of the country has broadband internet, but there are parts that don't, right? There's a huge lack of access to technology among students, and especially among underserved students. So one of the reasons the New York City public schools stayed open longer than other schools during COVID was because so many students who attend New York City public schools are homeless, right? They live in homeless shelters. They live on people's couches. They live in places where there's no Wi-Fi. So in order not to disrupt their learning, the schools stayed open an extra week or two so that we could install Wi-Fi in homeless shelters and send the students home. Now that's a terrible state of affairs for many, many, many reasons, right? But that's a problem we need to address. We've already started addressing it during COVID, right? So now homeless shelters have Wi-Fi. Now more students have access to technology. They have tablets. They are used to using these tablets for learning. And yeah, that's a digital divide we need to address for sure. So really, as we start building this out, like I said up top, we need to make sure that these programs are accessible on multiple platforms. So if you do something that is just in headset for students and you don't give students each a headset, that's going to create a divide. That's going to create a barrier. So building on platforms that allow students to learn on laptop, on desktop, on mobile, on tablet, and in the metaverse and in headset, that's really important, especially right now, right? Making it accessible, teaching kids how to use it, making sure that they're comfortable with the technology. That's really important. The nice thing is, most kids already are. Lots of kids are in Roblox, lots of kids are online. Understanding that will make it easier. But absolutely, that's something we need to focus on. We need to make sure that we are building a diverse, inclusive, and equitable metaverse for everyone. And that includes allowing everyone access. And that's actually, I'm teaching 2 classes on that this coming semester in the United States. So something I'm very passionate about and something that we definitely need to think about. And the final question, because we're coming to the end of my time with you, is talking about artificial intelligence. And that's an interesting one because that's a little outside the scope of the metaverse. People tend to lump a lot of these technologies together. So I hear people talk about Web3, and that encompasses the metaverse and virtual reality and augmented reality and blockchain and Bitcoin and NFTs and artificial intelligence, right? A lot of these upcoming tech terms kind of get dumped into a bucket together. But I do think it's interesting to think about how we can use artificial intelligence in teaching and incorporate that into the metaverse. And one thing that I've thought about quite a bit is how do we learn history in a way that is more interesting, right? So the way a lot of history is taught in the United States right now is reading textbooks, it's watching videos maybe. It's not that compelling. And a lot of this stuff is really compelling. A lot of these historical leaders are fascinating people. Some of them are terrible, some of them are great. Many of them are very interesting, right? You don't become a world historical figure by being dull. So instead of having a world where we just kind of read about these people on a page or watch a video about them or a movie, what if we could talk to them? Now, with a lot of these people, there is such a deep historical record, some of it just written, some of it videotaped, but we could actually train an AI algorithm to respond to questions in a way that feels real, based on either actual historical record or based on kind of extrapolating what that historical record would look like. So here's an example. A friend of mine built a really beautiful VR piece that allowed somebody to ask questions of a Holocaust survivor who was going back to the camp where he was interred to look after 50 years. And it was a really beautiful, moving, sad piece. And what they did was they spent hours interviewing this guy. And then they allowed people to ask him questions. Now, the artificial intelligence algorithm was trained such that even if a question he hadn't been asked in the interview was asked, it would learn that question. It would give an answer that sounded plausible, right? So the idea is that students, rather than reading about these world historical figures, can actually talk to them, ask them questions, understand their process, understand their thoughts. Now, that to me is a much more interesting way to learn about history than just words on a page. So that's where we can think about this new technology. That's where we get into the fun part, where we can brainstorm, where we can ideate, where we can build. So that's where I encourage you all to think as I wrap this up, right? Again, like I said up top, we're at the GeoCities phase of the metaverse. We're at the dial-up internet stage of the metaverse. It's not going to look the same in a few years. It's going to look very different. And that's great, right? Everything is always about growth and learning and opportunity and building. And it is incumbent on educators to be part of that, right? We made a lot of mistakes with Web 2, a lot, right? But we know what those mistakes are, and now we know how to fix them and how to prevent them. And one of the key things that we can do as we build the next iteration, the metaverse, is have everyone be involved from the ground up. So it's not just a bunch of guys who went to Harvard or Stanford or MIT building in Silicon Valley and with their friends who will look like them, right? That's the problem of Web 2. Web 3 needs to be built by and for everyone, and that includes educators, that includes students, that includes people from all over the world, all different types of people. So that's where we can go. And if I can leave you with one thought, I encourage you to just start experimenting. Get a headset if you can. Borrow a headset if you can. Spend some time, if you can't get a headset, spend some time in these platforms online. sign up for Spatial, sign up for Arthur, play around, go in VR chat, explore different worlds, see what you can do, and I guarantee you will learn something and be inspired. So again, thank you so much for having me. I regrettably can't be there in person, but I hope you enjoyed watching me talk from a screen for half an hour. These things are always kind of odd. And if you are interested in chatting more, you can feel free to add me on LinkedIn. My Twitter handle is just my name, Cortney Harding, Cortney with no U. I am online all sorts of places. My company's website is friendswithholograms.com. You can look at our work there. You can read some case studies, see who our clients are, hear what we're up to next. And my email is just my name, Cortney, at friendswithholograms.com. And you can also just message me on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever you find me. Like I said, I'm online far too much.